Do you ever wonder who truly prints the dollars you hold in your hand? Do you believe the U.S. government, a symbol of democracy and the power of the people, is in control of the nation's currency? If so, you have been deceived in a remarkably sophisticated way. Most Americans and people around the world assume the Federal Reserve, the Fed, is a part of the government, operating for the public good. But the truth is far more complex and alarming. Imagine this: a group of people, not elected by the public, not accountable to Congress, and not bound by any ballot, holds the power to print a nation's currency. They can create money out of thin air, dictate lending interest rates, and even inadvertently trigger a recession or inflate asset bubbles. All of this is done with a few keystrokes in a closed room. The real question we must ask is, are we living in a democratic economic system, or are we merely playing a part in a massive magic show where financial freedom is an illusion and our hard work is silently serving a powerful, unknown elite? In this video, we will pull back the curtain, dissect the controversial history of the Fed's founding, decipher its undemocratic operating mechanism, and reveal why true financial freedom is impossible without understanding the truth about this organization. Brace yourself, because what you're about to hear may change the way you see money and the world forever. To understand what the Fed is, we cannot merely look at its current economic functions. We must turn back time to the early 20th century, when the U.S. financial system was like a rickety machine, constantly failing due to a series of banking panics, most notably the crisis of 1907. It was at this time that the financial magnates realized they needed a more powerful tool, not just to stabilize the market, but to control it from the shadows. In 1910, a group of men, not elected officials, not representatives of the people, but representatives of the most powerful financial dynasties of the era, J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Rothschild, secretly boarded a private train to Jekyll Island, a luxurious resort off the coast of Georgia. Led by Senator Nelson Aldrich, who was related by marriage to the Rockefeller family, they discussed for days how to establish a completely new central banking system. What's strange is that everything was kept as secret as a spy operation. The members used false names, avoided all written records, and even agreed not to call each other by name during the meeting. Why would a meeting, supposedly for the public good, need to be so secretive? 3 years later, the result of that meeting became a reality. The Federal Reserve Act was passed on the night of December 23, 1913, when most of Congress was on holiday. There was no public debate, no oversight from the people, just a small group of politicians and magnates quietly pushing through a decision that would shape the next century. From that moment, the Fed was born. But not as a public agency. It was a semi-public, semi-private system where private commercial banks owned shares and profited from the nation's money-printing machine. This is the crucial point. The Fed is not a government agency in the true sense. Instead, it is a network of 12 regional reserve banks, and each of these banks is owned by the private commercial banks in the local area. These banks not only contribute capital, but also receive a fixed annual dividend from the Fed's profits, a form of regular payout regardless of whether the economy is booming or in crisis. The Fed is often described as being independent of the government to avoid political influence. But have you ever wondered why no one talks about the possibility of the Fed being influenced by the financial elite? The irony is that the very private banks that own the Fed have the right to nominate its local branch directors, meaning they are simultaneously the players, the rule makers, and the scorekeepers. An unelected, opaque organization holding absolute power over something everyone needs: money. If true power is the ability to decide a nation's destiny, then the Fed is one of the most powerful organizations on the planet. It doesn't need an army or an election. A simple announcement about interest rates can send global financial markets into turmoil. The Fed is granted full control over U.S. monetary policy. It decides the interest rates for interbank lending, the amount of money to be injected into the market, and how to respond to financial crises. So if you are paying more for a home loan or prices are soaring due to inflation, it could be because of a Fed decision. Yet the paradox is that no one in the public has the right to directly elect the people who run this organization. The Fed chairman and governors are appointed by the president and approved by the Senate, which sounds reasonable. But once appointed, the Fed operates like an independent kingdom within the United States. The most critical decisions like raising or lowering interest rates or printing trillions of dollars are made behind closed doors without media or public representation and are often announced only after the fact. You might think, surely there must be a body to audit the Fed. The answer is yes, but only a very small part. Some of the Fed's administrative activities are audited by an internal inspector general, but its monetary policy decisions, the real source of its power, are exempt from government oversight. Why is an organization that holds the financial destiny of over 300 million people not subject to the same oversight as a public agency? Why can its leaders make decisions that can wipe out trillions of dollars from the market without asking anyone for permission or explaining themselves? If an organization like this does not represent the people, is not transparent to the people, and is not accountable to the people, then who does it represent? Now, let's look at the Fed's monetary mechanism. How does the Fed create and control money? We grow up with a naive belief that money is something earned through labor. But at the deepest level of the financial system, money doesn't come from value, it comes from debt. And the entity that triggers this process is none other than the Federal Reserve. Contrary to popular belief, the Fed doesn't just turn on a printing press and hand out money. On paper, the Fed is not allowed to directly finance the government. So how do they do it? The answer is a sophisticated three-party coordination. First, the U.S. government issues bonds to borrow money. Large commercial banks and financial institutions buy these bonds through auctions. The Fed then steps onto the stage, buying back these bonds on the open market, and pays for them with new money it creates. No printing press is needed, just a credit entry in the account of the bank that sold the bonds. And just like that, new money is born out of thin air. Money doesn't come from production, it comes from faith in a debt. Let that sink in. Every time the Fed buys bonds, new money is created, and in return, the government makes a promise of debt. Money equals debt, and the government will have to pay back that money with taxes from the people. In other words, we are paying interest on money created out of thin air by an unelected organization. This three-party game works so smoothly that no one wants to stop it. The government wants to spend freely without raising taxes. The banks want to sell bonds to the Fed, get cash, and lend it out for profit. The Fed wants to inject money into the market to keep the financial system stable. And so debt is created, money is born, financial assets swell, and the people get tired of inflation. A question arises. The Fed can only issue currency by buying bonds. So what if no one wants to sell bonds to the Fed? In theory, this is a valid question, but in reality, it almost never happens. Because the Fed has the power to set interest rates, and when they want to buy, they set a price attractive enough that sellers cannot refuse. Commercial banks want the Fed to buy because it gives them liquid cash, reduces the risk of holding bonds, and frees up capital to lend and make a profit. So what is called the open market is sometimes just a formality for a predetermined decision. This creates an extremely dangerous consequence. Money becomes more and more virtual, but debt becomes more and more real. Every dollar created is a debt that needs to be paid, and for the system to survive, new debt must always be greater than old debt. It is no coincidence that the U.S. has never paid off its national debt in modern history, because if it did, the system would collapse. You are not working for money. You are working for a debt you didn't create. You try to save, invest, and spend wisely, but the money you hold does not reflect true value. It is the result of a system built to print debt, collect interest, and make an entire society dependent on a tiny group of people behind the curtain. Money is not just a medium of exchange, it is a tool of control, and the Fed is the place where that chain is forged. If you think the Fed only affects Americans, think again. What the Fed controls is not just national monetary policy, but the entire global financial bloodstream, the U.S. dollar. After World War II, the Bretton Woods system was established, laying the foundation for a new order. National currencies would be pegged to the USD, and the USD would be pegged to gold.
But in 1971, President Nixon ended the gold standard, and from then on, the USD was no longer backed by gold, but by faith. This faith is maintained by military power, diplomacy, and, most importantly, the financial power of the Fed. Even without gold, the world could not abandon the dollar. Why? More than 60% of global foreign reserves are in USD. The trade of oil, gold, gas, and commodities
is mainly conducted in USD. Even when two countries with no relation to the US want to trade, they often have to use the dollar. The USD became the world's reserve currency, an invisible throne upon which the Fed sits. Countries owe debt in USD but cannot print USD. This is the most sophisticated lever of power. Developing nations often borrow in USD to finance infrastructure, imports, and economic development. But they can't print USD. So every time the Fed raises interest rates and tightens the money supply, these nations immediately face difficulties. Debt becomes more expensive, capital flees, and their domestic currency plummets. A single Fed decision can push an entire country into a debt crisis. A classic example is the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the debt crisis in South America, or more recently, Sri Lanka. All are linked to borrowing in USD without control over the money supply. In 1974, the U.S. reached a strategic agreement with Saudi Arabia. OPEC would only sell oil in USD, and in return, the U.S. would provide security and military support to the kingdom. Since then, every country wanting to buy oil must first stockpile USD, creating natural demand for the dollar and allowing the Fed to print as much money as it wants without fear of collapse. This is why the U.S. can run a budget deficit for decades without paying the price that other countries would. A terrifying tactic of the Fed is to pump money into emerging markets, let them swell, and then pop the bubble. When the Fed lowers interest rates and injects money into the market, cheap money flows into emerging markets. Stocks and real estate in these countries soar, creating the illusion of growth. But when the Fed raises interest rates and tightens the money supply, foreign capital flees, the market collapses, and the currency devalues. The irony is that the Fed has never made a decision for the benefit of other countries, but every one of its decisions affects them. So where does this lead? To a global financial order where the U.S. has the unique privilege of issuing the world's global commodity, the USD. The Fed is the sole issuer, while the rest of the world borrows, holds, and fears money without the power to create it. An empire that doesn't need weapons to conquer the world. It just needs to control the currency the whole world has to use. We live in an age where everyone talks about financial freedom, passive income, smart investing, and early retirement. But there is a truth few dare to speak. Financial freedom is impossible if you don't understand the game you've been pulled into. Because this is not a fair playing field. The current financial system is not designed for you to become independent. It's designed for you to borrow money, pay interest, and work continuously to service debt, while the real value of money silently evaporates. Inflation is not an accident. It is a default mechanism. Every year your money intentionally loses value, not due to war, pandemic, or supply shortages, but because the Fed and other central banks actively create inflation. Inflation is an invisible tax on the uninformed. You save, and your money loses value. You hold cash, and your assets are eroded every hour. You spend cautiously, and you are punished for not injecting money into the economy. Meanwhile, what about the creators of this system? They don't get rich by saving. They don't labor for a salary. They use the leverage of debt, financial assets, and their position in the system. And above all, they understand how money works. You are fighting in a game where the rules are only taught to the elite. They teach you how to spend money, not how to create it. They teach you to save, while the system itself is designed to make savings useless. They teach you to work hard, but money flows to those who control assets, not those who put in the effort. True financial freedom begins when you see the matrix. Not everyone can control the Fed, but anyone can start by understanding how the system operates. From there, you are no longer someone caught in the spiral of debt and inflation, but you begin to think like an issuer, not a consumer. You transact with assets, not with time. You accumulate value instead of hoarding money that is losing value every day.
If you don't understand the system, you are an exploited part of it. A lack of understanding about money doesn't make you poor immediately. It just makes you work your whole life in a system designed for you to never escape. Because in a world where money is born from debt, the person who understands the system is the only one with a chance at freedom. The Fed is not an ordinary bank. It does not represent the people. And the USD, which the whole world relies on, is no longer a symbol of value, but a symbol of power. In a world where money is born from debt, will you choose to remain a manipulated consumer, or will you start learning how to break the invisible chains that bind you? The question for you is, if the Fed were to collapse tomorrow and the USD lost its faith, what do you think would happen to the global financial system? Is this a risk or an opportunity for the world to reset its monetary order? Please leave a comment below, because awakening begins with a conversation. If you think the information in this video should be known by more people, please share it. And if you want to continue exploring the truths behind money, power, and freedom, don't forget to subscribe to the Global Hot Takes English podcast.